as president of the country. Is that correct?
I discuss with them
Yes.
from a personal
From
capacity.
a personal capacity.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
We may come back to that issue in relation to another matter arising in the statement of Mr. Maseko, but for the moment, what is apparent from the statement of Maseko, Mr. Maseko just read to you, is that the Guptas were, to put it mildly, quite forceful in their request or demand to Mr. Maseko. That so much is apparent. Do you agree?
Well, if you read what is here,
Yes,
I think that's what it shows.
indeed. And it seems too that Mr. A.J. Gupta at least was very confident of support within government. What he says is, and this is what Mr. Maseko's version is, at this point he, Mr. A.J. Gupta, told me I was being uncooperative and that he was going to speak to my seniors in government who would sort me out. He appeared to be confident that he had the support of his seniors in government who would, quote, sort me out and replace me with people who would cooperate with him. That much is also apparent from what Mr. Maseko said. That now would, as far as you are aware, insofar as the project is concerned, do you know whether Mr. Gupta was justified in saying that he had government support?
I'm not sure whether I should really interpret people's mood and how they addressed one another. Because it is here from from Mr. Maseko, who discussed this with Gupta.
Yes.
Now, how do I interpret them? I think the trend has been that we are actually saying I should be saying something on interactions that I was not part of.
No, I understand that, and you make a good point. My question, though, had a different object, and let me rephrase it. The factual question that I ask is, did Mr. Gupta enjoy, as he appears to have said he did, government support in the New Age project?
I don't know really.
You don't know?
Because I've never participated in a discussion that discussed that matter with government people.
Maybe one could put it this way. From what Mr. Maseko has said in his statement, if what he says is true, it appears that Mr. A.J. Gupta believed that if Mr. Maseko did not cooperate, he could get Mr. Maseko's seniors to sort him out, to use that word. Maybe let's look at, let's start with who Mr. Maseko's seniors would have been in government. Would it have been the minister in the presidency? Would that be correct?
Yeah, definitely.
That would be correct.
That would be correct.
And above the minister, it would be the president.
Yes.
Yes. Is there anything you know which would have made Mr. A.J. Gupta, if what Mr. Maseko is saying is true, which would have made him believe that if Mr. Maseko didn't do what he wanted him to do, he could talk to Mr. Maseko's seniors to sort him out? Is there anything you know on the basis of which Mr. A.J. Gupta could really say that?
No, I don't know.
He goes on, Mr. Zuma, on page 9, in paragraph 43, to say, "This matter was of great concern to me, especially when I started receiving complaints from heads of communication from other departments complaining that they were being harassed by people from the New Age newspaper who were demanding either meetings or advertising budgets." Do you know anything about complaints of heads of communication from other departments complaining of harassment at the hands of the New Age newspaper?
No, I didn't get that.
But again, it's evident that the New Age project under the Guptas, if Mr. Maseko's evidence is accepted, was being vigorously pursued. Did they ever report back to you on this? Did you have meetings with the Guptas about the progress of the New Age project?
Well, from time to time, they briefed me.
Right. And would they have briefed you about how the financing of the project was to be achieved? It would seem a fairly reasonable assumption to make. No.
No.
What
They
did
were
they
just
brief you
briefing
about?
me on the progress they were making,
And what type of progress would that have been then?
establishing that business, the newspaper, as it were.
But you say not the financing.
No, not the financing.
All right. The next section of the evidence that we would like your comment on, Mr. Zuma, is under the heading, "My Exit from the Public Service."
Maybe before that, if what Mr. Masego says Mr. Ajay Gupta said to him, namely, I will speak to your seniors to sort you out, and bearing in mind that you have indicated that Mr. Masego's seniors would have been the minister in the presidency, and above the minister it would be the president. If what Mr. Masego says Mr. Ajay said is true, would you agree that then Mr. Ajay Gupta would have been abusing whatever relationship or friendship he may have had with Mr. Masego's seniors in order to try and get government work?
Well, I wouldn't be able to answer the question correctly because I really don't know what made Mr. Mr. Ajay to say that. The senior that on operational matters, the immediate senior and who would deal with all of these things would be the minister, not the president, be the minister. That's why Masego would go to the minister and report the kind of treatment that he has got from an individual. And it ends there. I'm just making a point that you can't have the president participating in those kind of discussions in all departments.
But are you not able to say, we don't know Mr. Ajay Gupta's version. It might be different from Mr. Masego's version. But that is why I say, if what Mr. Masego is true, are you not able to say, if what Mr. Masego says was said by Mr. Ajay Gupta is true, that would have been improper?
Yes.
Are you able to say that?
No, I'm able to say so.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
You did say, Mr. Zuma, that these sorts of matters would not be discussed with a president, but you have also said the matters were indeed discussed privately.
Yes.
Some matters were discussed privately.
Yes.
So
I said so.
the Guptas might have felt free to discuss these issues with you in your private capacity, as you've already said.
If they discuss anything with him, we did not discuss the operational things.
Paragraph 47, if I may read it to Mr. Zuma, says, towards the end of January 2011, I received a call from the Minister Chabani asking me to meet him at his office urgently. I met him at his office the following morning. At the meeting, he advised me that he had been instructed by the President to redeploy me or terminate my contract henceforth. If I may ask, we know that at around this time, Mr. Maseko did actually leave certainly the post that he held at the time as CEO of GCIS. We know that as a fact. Is that agreed?
Yes, I think he left around that time.
And I don't want to go into the detail of the law with you, but as I understand it, if Mr. Maseko was transferred, as he was, to another department, the law says that would be your decision. Do I understand correctly?
It would be, yes, it would be the decision taken in the main between what would have happened. The minister would have briefed the president because the DGs are actually deployed by the cabinet, That type of a report will therefore be given to or reflected in the government, but the ministers would have discussed that with the president. They come because of whatever to say, Mr. President, this is what I'm doing. And if the president thinks that this is unfair or whatever, would say, but why? They'd have to explain. If the explanation, at times the explanation might not even be satisfying, but if the minister says, look, I just can't work with this DG, it happens all the time. You can't force the minister. So say, okay, proceed, and then follow the process.
So in the ordinary course, as required by law, you would have participated in any decision regarding a DG in the Department of the Presidency?
In
the Presidency.
Just repeat, I don't know whether I'm
Well,
getting you.
Just repeat the question, I think.
We dealt with this matter yesterday, but it's as well to clarify, Mr. Zuma. As the head of GCIS, Mr. Maseko worked in the Department of the Presidency, correct?
Yeah.
Which fell under yourself at the time. And the minister then was Minister Chabani. So in any decision about the termination of service of Mr. Maseko or in relation to his transfer, you would have been consulted.
Definitely.
Right.
Not just by the minister in the presidency only, all ministers.
Right. Okay.
All ministers.
Okay. Well, Mr. Maseko's evidence is that Mr. Chabani told him that he had been instructed by the president to redeploy me or terminate my contract henceforth. What do you say about that statement?
No, I
I
never instructed the minister to do so.
Did you discuss the issue with the minister?
No, the minister discussed the fact that he would like to transfer Mr. Maseko.
Did he say why?
Well, I think there was an issue between the two of them. I can't remember the details. like all ministers, he would come for us to be able to either agree so that an action is taken, not to discuss, if at all there were issues which were necessary to be said, because it's a big decision, he will indicate that. That is because of this and that, or
Well,
because,
Just finish before I say
yeah,
something.
because either we can no longer work together, or because we don't agree, or because I think I don't need him anymore, whatever. The discussion would, because he can't take a decision to change the DG without, because that is not his decision.
Well, I think with the time that we are talking about, when Mr. Masego was moved from the position of CEO of GCIS and was moved to be Director General of the Department of Public Service and Administration, was around 2011, end of January or thereabout. Have you got a recollection of how that happened? I've got the picture of how that happened.
That specific,
Specific incident of his, whether one can call it a removal from GCIS to Public Service and Administration, or a transfer from GCIS to Public Service Administration, Do you recall how that occurred? Obviously, having read Mr. Masego's statement and understanding what his version is.
well, I don't remember exactly, but I know that there was a bit of shifting of the DGs around that time.
Yes, yes.
And the department that handles that is public administration, who will then discuss with the ministers
Yes,
on whatever reasons.
yes,
And then once that happens, and that will then be reported,
yes,
once it becomes a decision to the cabinet.
yes.
I might not remember the details why this happened, but I know there was a movement that was
Yes,
done.
yes, yes.
But I can't remember exactly what was the cause. At times, the changes come because either a DG could perform better in one place, and therefore he must go and help there, and another one is replaced. But I can't remember exactly what, on this particular DG, what was the problem. But that matter would have been discussed more in some details at a level of the minister and the Minister of Public Administration.
Public Service and Administration.
Once they're agreed, they will then come with a recommendation. They generally come with a recommendation unless if there's a problem. For an example, if they can't work together, or if they think this particular DG would perform better there. And once they report and say, we've discussed the matter, we've agreed. And then the cabinet will take a decision.
When you read Mr. Masego's statement, did you see what he says happened with regard to that, with regard to his removal? He says he was told by Minister Chabane that you had called from outside of the country because you were outside of the country at the time. He says he was told by Minister Chabane that you had called and you had said that he must be redeployed, that is Mr. Masego, or his services must be terminated. And he says Mr. Chabane was not happy with this, but he had to carry it out, and he said to him, because I know you are a good, I think, civil servant, he said, I'll try and make a plan for you. And Mr. Masego says he didn't want, Mr. Chabane didn't want to, so to speak, throw him into the street. So I think what Mr. Pretorius is asking is that context. I'm just providing a fuller context. He's whether you have any recollection of you having asked Mr. Chabane to redeploy him. In other words, according to Mr. Masego, from what he was told by Mr. Chabane, the idea that he should be moved from GCIS came from the president and not from Minister Chabane. Are you able to throw any light?
No, I think I have a difficulty with this, that if, let us assume I wanted Masego out,
Yes.
I will wait until I leave the country. And when I'm very far away, then call. It's quite funny. I'm not running a department. Why would I have not talked to Minister Chabane when I was here? Why should I wait until I go? It's a little bit fishy. Now, I don't want to make a point, but I can make a point because this commission has experienced this. At times, people use the names of the president. I'm sure you had a witness here,
Yes, last week.
which said he was lying. He'd never had any instruction from the president. I'm sure that could happen with the ministers as well. If the minister is finding it difficult to say to the DG, I'm now saying go, and use the name of the president. Because I don't see why I should leave the country. Only when I'm abroad, then I must attend to this issue. It's a little bit strange and funny. And I never phoned Chabane about this DG when I was abroad, not at all.
Yes.
Chair, there's a request to
Yes.
address you.
Thank you. Mr. Skakam.
No, Mr.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Tabane. However,
I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry.
yes, Mr. Zuma. Chair, we, together with just the legal team, we have a duty to raise concerns
Yes.
when we see a development in the manner in which our client is being cross-examined. Essentially, what is going on now
Yes.
is that Mr. Pretorius is cross-examining Mr. Zuma. He's cross-examining about issues we are not clear about insofar as the terms of reference are concerned. We, as you recall, Mr. Chair, Mr. Zuma has read this affidavit. We have read it. We took the view that it does not implicate the president in any of the terms of reference that this commission is about. That is the attitude we took. Now, of course, in your discretion, you decided the president should come and address and take and give his version of events. What is going on now is not Mr. Pretorius assisting Mr. Zuma to give his version. What he's doing, he's cross-examining him. But which is not a problem. If Mr. Zuma's attitude had been that there are aspects in the statement of Mr. Masego that implicate him in fraud, corruption, and this state capture. We were not able to follow how to fit this cross-examination in which he seeks Mr. Zuma to recall meetings where he was not present, in which he seeks Mr. Zuma to interpret what those meetings meant, or even to give a view of whether those meetings were appropriate or not. It's not fair. If this is if the legal team of the commission wishes to cross-examine Mr. Zuma, it's important that Mr. Zuma is in fact given an opportunity to then reflect with a view that he's going to be cross-examined, to reflect on all these things. Because you say, the rules of the commission say, you look at an affidavit that implicates you or that mentions your name, you make a judgment call on whether or not that the allegations made in that affidavit are of a nature that fit within the investigative powers of the commission, fraud, corruption, and state capture. Now, he's being asked to recall phone calls and meetings where he was not present, and to interpret what those meetings would mean. We think it's unfair, because what essentially it means is this. If he cannot say, for example, that he thinks that the meeting between Mr. Gupta, Ajay Gupta and Mr. Masego was inappropriate, then you must read something into it. It's not right. If the commission rules, for example, that this line of questioning is the correct line of questioning that must be adopted, it's no longer it's cross-examination. You're trying to prove that Mr. Zuma's private conversation were somehow relevant to his public interaction, or his interaction with the Guptas in public. Give him an opportunity to then look at this with a view that is going to be cross-examined, and then he can prepare adequately for cross-examination. Not what is not this. This would say, in our view, in our assessment as lawyers, is cross-examination for which a witness ought to have been given a fair opportunity to be told that if you are not going to for example, respond to Mr. Masego, you may nonetheless be called and be cross-examined on what Mr. Masego says. He is being cross-examined on what Mr. Masego says. How can the president be expected to remember meetings where he was not there? Phone calls that occurred years ago. I don't recall phone calls that happened last week. Now, Mr. Zuma must recall conversations that he had with Mr. Masego years ago, and what they may have meant. I think let's be fair and stick to what this commission is about. The terms of reference, bearing in mind that Mr. Zuma's assessment of this affidavit is that it does not implicate him in fraud and corruption. If the commission's view is that it does, let them put those questions to him. Not ask him to remember meetings if this affidavit is anywhere says that Mr. Zuma was corrupt in A, B, C, and D, then he must put that to Mr. Zuma, because that is exactly within the terms of reference that this commission is about. This line of, we do this often, but we do it to opponents to witnesses whom we are cross-examining. Not witnesses who are supposed to just inquire about information, because we expected that the commission would be asking for clarity on certain things. Not pose questions that amount to cross-examination. That is what that's what we thought we would bring to the attention of the committee. Incidentally, we wanted to do that in chambers.
Yes.
But we thought, no, actually, it's probably apt to bring it to your attention now,
Yes,
so that if there is a need for us to then regroup and determine how we deal with it, then we deal with it. Because if Mr. Pretorius wants to continue with cross-examination, we waited yesterday because we realized it was actually cross-examination. But we said, no, maybe later on we will see an approach that seeks to establish facts. If Mr. Zuma says, I don't remember that meeting, that should be the end of the matter. Why should it then be asked, oh, but you would have discussed this privately? Where is he taking this to? Terms of reference. In the terms of reference. Let's be loyal to the terms of reference.
Thank you.
That's what we want to put.
I'll hear what Mr. Pretorius has to say. I had a little bit of concern in relation to questions that related to the meeting that Mr. Masego had with the Guptas, which obviously Mr. Zuma did not attend. But with regard to the removal or transfer of Mr. Masego from GCIS to the Department of Public Service and Administration, my recollection is that his statement and or evidence suggested that he was removed from his position as CEO of GCIS because he did not cooperate with the Guptas and that he was told that by the Minister Chabane that was at the instance of the former president. That's my recollection of what he said. Of course, if one talks about a phone call that happened many years ago, some calls one might recall because of their distinct nature or significance, but some one would not recall. Sometimes one might not even recall a call that happened a few months ago. But my understanding of Mr. Masego's evidence suggested that the Guptas were unhappy that he did not cooperate with them, and that he was removed when there were no grounds to remove him, and that was at the instance, based on what he was told, he said, by Minister Chabane of the former president. But let me hear what Mr.
Sorry,
Yes.
perhaps before you
Yes.
take. Firstly, in relation to what the chairperson has just sketched out, the first point would be this. Mr. Pretorius must say that they are going to bring the Guptas, or whoever they allege in the Guptas, the witness from the Guptas were going to say that they was going to confirm this interaction that Masego is talking about. Because it is not, you see, Chair, what you said in terms of the terms of reference was that if you are implicated on the issues that are within the terms of reference, then you are going to be given an opportunity to put your version and then and then of course somebody might ask to cross-examine you. Someone might ask to cross-examine you. We didn't get the impression that the evidence leaders here's job would be to cross-examine witnesses. But even on the issue that Masego complains about, that he was fired because, or he was transferred because of some intervention that came from the presidency, that's an issue that he says, we assess it. We say, in terms of the terms of reference, there are no allegations he's making on corruption. If you bring Mr. AJ or any of the Guptas here in the commission, and they say to you, we did speak to Mr. Masego. We in fact told him that we're at the ear of the president, and that if he's not cooperating on this business, we will certainly we'll use that relationship and get him removed. We think it's highly unfair. If the Guptas are not going to be here to testify and to corroborate what Mr. Masego has said here, it's just unfair to ask the president to recall or to interpret what role he may have played in the removal of Mr. Masego. But the other thing, that reason why we did not think that falls within your terms of reference is because it's something that has to do with how government decides to remove people who are employed there, or redeploy them, or transfer them into different units. It is not within, if Mr. Masego's allegation is that there was corruption, he must say so in unequivocal terms, or that his transfer was in pursuance of a corrupt deal. He must say so. It cannot be read through cross-examination, which cross-examination we're not prepared for. Because what we were prepared for, when we were invited by the commission, was for Mr. Zuma to be asked clarification questions, not going through pages and paragraphs and cross-examining him on issues that he has elected to take a position, a legal position, which is that he's not going to get involved in Masego's speculation about what he's meeting with the Guptas, who authorized it, and what else. If Masego is bold enough to say, I was removed because the president was unhappy that I was not doing the right thing, he must say so. And that this right thing that I was being asked this right thing that I was doing was in accordance with the law, but the president wanted me to do something corrupt. Then we're in the terms of reference. Then we would have said to the president, Mr. President, Mr. Masego says you're corrupt, and this is how he says you're corrupt. And then Mr. President would have said, okay, let me respond. This is my statement. The commission would have a statement answering allegations of corruption or state capture or whatever it is and fraud. If Mr. Masego's accusations of Mr. Zuma amounted to that he was corrupt, there was a fraudulent conduct on his behalf, or that there was something about state capture that one must read in it. You can't, it's not fair to call a former president to come and talk about how an official of government was removed when you are not alleging that there was corruption. Please make the allegation that there was corruption, and then let the president deal with that, or that there was fraud.
Well, you see, when you deal with a case in litigation in court, it's easy to say when you are for one side, the other side must make out its case, because that's litigation. Where it's an inquiry, a person may come and say, this is what I know. I'm placing before the commission what I know and what happened. And the commission must inquire whether that may have anything to do with any impropriety. So while on the one hand there must be fairness, there can be no doubt about that, but one also needs to understand that unlike in litigation where one is able to say, well, that party must make its case clear in the pleadings and in the affidavits, in an inquiry you have a situation where people say, I'm only here to say what I know. What you make of that in terms of your inquiry, whether you think it's relevant or irrelevant, but this is what I am here to say. So one has got to look at all of that. But
With respect, I understand that, Chairperson,
Yeah.
but even within the Commission of Inquiry, firstly, it would be a misunderstanding if you understood, Mr. Chair, that I was invoking a litigation strategy.
no.
All I'm saying is
Yes.
this, that in the statements that you get, even if a complainant comes here before the commission and complains, the complaint must be investigated if the allegations that complaint makes fall within the terms of reference of the commission. I'm saying we advised Mr. Zuma that Mr. Masego's statement did not accuse him of any corruption or any fraud or any state capture. He's unhappy with some things and all that. What is happening here? And so we said to Mr. Zuma, so we don't think that you should put a statement. So that's why you don't have a statement. In terms of the rules, you are allowed not to put a statement to explain what Mr. Masego says, because he doesn't implicate you in what the commission is about. So Mr. Zuma decides he's not going to put a statement. That is what he has done. But what has happened here is that having taken advantage and used the full right he has in terms of the commission rules, not to respond to a litigant or to a witness who makes allegations that don't amount to corruption. What is happening here is just not what we think should be happening. And that is why, as I say, Chair, we sat there and we thought, no, actually, because he's a guest of the commission, let's see what they really want from him. What information are they looking from him in relation to Mr. Masego? Does he make the allegation of corruption, fraud, and state capture against him, for which he should be called to answer? And that's why we're anxious with these kind of questions. In this kind of forum, a lot can be read from the questions that he reads and from the answers they get. And we do not want this commission to end up in a situation where it's unfair to Mr. Zuma, because it has said to Mr. Zuma, if no one makes allegations of corruption or fraud or state capture, you don't have to put a statement. You don't need to ask Mr. Masego to cross-examine Mr. Masego on it. And he has done that. We accept that you can call him to ask clarity questions. Please ask clarity questions, and not questions that amount to cross-examining, because we're going into credibility when we cross-examine a witness. We're going to credibility. So Mr. Masego is being measured against, his allegations are being measured against Mr. Zuma. And we want to be sure that that is not something that, that they're trying to invoke the credibility of the witness and whether he can be trusted for his recollection of what Mr. Masego says. So we're asking the commission to be fair to the extent that it accepts that Mr. Zuma has been called at its instance to seek clarity questions, not to ask questions that amount to cross-examination. And what has been happening is cross-examination.
Let me hear Mr. Pretorius.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I don't want to enter into a long debate as to what questioning is and what cross-examination is. Safe to say that there is no pleaded case or charge sheet which we are seeking to validate or sections of which we're seeking to prove through our questioning. So insofar as it may be alleged that we are seeking to question, to prove a particular pleaded case in a civil matter or a particular criminal case as represented by a charge sheet, that is simply not correct. What we are doing is affording Mr. Zuma a full opportunity to deal with all the factual evidence that Mr. Maseko led, and indeed the implications of that evidence. And it would be grossly unfair to Mr. Zuma not to allow him that full opportunity to deal with what might have been said by Mr. Maseko and also what might have been intended by him to have been conveyed. And once Mr. Zuma has dealt with it, as he is dealing with it, I really don't see that we are traversing any rules. But insofar as we are, Chair, you will no doubt pull me up and guide me accordingly. And I'm quite willing to accept such, obviously, such intervention by yourself. The second point is in relation to our assumed obligation to call the Guptas to corroborate Mr. Maseko before questions can be asked. I'm not sure that it's correct at all to say that you can't ask questions about the evidence of one witness until it's been corroborated by another witness. One needn't deal with that issue any further. Thirdly, terms of reference. I understand the argument to be that unless there's a direct allegation of fraud and corruption against Mr. Zuma, we're precluded from entering into this arena. May I just highlight paragraph 1.1 of our terms of reference, which just says, whether and to what extent and by whom attempts were made through any form of inducement or for any gain whatsoever nature to influence. The improper influence of members of the National Executive and the improper influence of Mr. Maseko falls squarely within our terms of reference, and it is only fair to Mr. Zuma in these circumstances to ask him what he knew, if anything, about him, to enable him either to distance himself, as he has to date, completely from that undue influence, or to admit that I did have, because I was in support of the project. It's not unfair to ask Mr. Zuma those questions so he can give his version as to what the import of the evidence of Mr. Maseko might be. And Mr. Maseko's evidence, which we were dealing with now, which gave rise to the objection, at least the timing of the objection, is particular in that what Mr. Maseko says is that following in the context of Mr. Maseko's failure to accede to what may well be argued improper influence, he was fired. And it would be grossly unfair to Mr. Zuma if the legal team were to ask you to make findings in that regard because the evidence was unchallenged and Mr. Zuma hasn't had an opportunity to deal with it. Let me deal with another term of reference, 1.6. It says whether our mandate is to investigate whether there were any irregularities, undue enrichment, corruption, and undue influence in the awarding of contracts, government advertising in the New Age newspaper. So this whole issue of government advertising is particularly highlighted in the terms of reference in relation not only to fraud and corruption, but in relation to any influence that might be argued to be undue. And quite fairly to Mr. Zuma, he commented on that yesterday, saying that the influence sought to be exercised was not entirely proper. He used his own words, I can't recall them at the moment. Sorry. So basically, all one needs to do for the moment and going forward is, in fairness to Mr. Zuma, put to Mr. Zuma the import of what Mr. Maseko has done. I don't have far to go at all, and I submit the line of questioning has been not only proper but necessary in order to ensure that in relation to all the evidence, its import, Mr. Zuma has a fair opportunity to deal with it. I have never said to Mr. Zuma, I put it to you, as cross-examiners who've featured prominently on TV in the past have done, that you are wrong and this is the version that we seek to prove.
Yes, you would like to
In
respond.
the tradition of Audi, I
Yes.
like Mr. Pretorius respond to some of the
Yes.
things that he says.
Yes.
First, Chair, what is astonishing for us is that this commission clearly was created around the work that the president had done. We have not received a single invitation from the evidence leaders for them to interview Mr. Zuma privately, as they've done with the other witnesses. To say to Mr. Zuma, we would like you to give us a view of what's going on here and to explain certain things, which is what they've done. Mr. Zuma is not being treated the same way that other ministers who have appeared here, who appear to be witnesses of the commission. A decent way of dealing with this, and I don't mean disrespect to the commission or to the commission leaders, would have been to say he's a major witness of what they are investigating. Let us talk to him first. Let us understand what statement we can get from him, because then it's easier to lead him, as they have led other witnesses, other ministers they have led here in the commission. They have led them because they've been able to put together a statement from them with evidence, and therefore they can take the minister through the aspects. Why has Mr. Zuma been brought in this manner, if it was not to cross-examine him? So I'm saying, in respect to Mr. He says, well, you know, this is not a criminal charge. We're not proving a charge. We're not in civil trial. He's simplifying the issues. He knows that what's going on here is of interest to the criminal law enforcement processes. He knows that. Why is he diminishing the value of this process by saying nothing? We don't have a charge sheet. We're not trying to prove a civil claim. In fact, it's not right. And now that I know what his views are on this issue, it is not right the way he wants to carry on with this. The decent thing to have done, if this was a commission witness, as others have been commission witnesses, the decent way to have done it is to say, you are at the helm of the executive that we're looking at. We would like to talk to you about it. They address a letter to Mr. Mancha. Mr. Mancha would say, okay, guys, we'll talk to the president. You come and see him at Nkandla. He will tell you exactly what you want. They then create a statement, as they have done with other ministers. Why have they done it this way? So I'm saying,
Yes.
let's be fair. In fact, when he says it would be unfair to Mr. Zuma, that's really a statement that I think should not be dignified. Because what is fair to Mr. Zuma is to be treated in accordance with the spirit and the purpose of this commission. It is not in the spirit of this commission to come here and to say, well, it's in the terms of reference that you can investigate anything. What is just read here specifically says it is specific. It requires that a witness makes an allegation that there is fraud and corruption. It's not left to speculation. And in fact, they could have sorted out most of these things that they're asking now if they'd done what they'd done with the other ministers. If they'd gone to him and said, look, I mean, we now are in the middle of a commission you established. We would like to hear what you say about some of the things that have come up. We'll then do a statement, and then we're going to bring it to the commission, and then we're going to lead the evidence, not cross-examine you. So what are we meant to do with this? It's not right. We would suggest that you seriously consider that proposal of asking them to talk to him about the things that they want, to then make a statement, if they want to make a statement, and then to lead him properly. This is cross-examination, and his legal team, we cannot sit there and he can say whatever he wants to say. You don't, a cross-examination question is not, it is not practice, and he's more senior than I am. It's not practice that you say, I put it to you. That's not how we identify whether this is a cross-examination or not. The fact that it doesn't say, I put it to you, doesn't mean that the question is not a cross-examination question. There are serious credibility issues that he's pursuing here that we're concerned about. This is not how we envisage that this commission intends to pursue this issue. Would seriously urge, Chair, that you consider asking them to see if they cannot have a conversation with the president about these issues, so they have a statement from him, not to simply spring things from him that the way in which they are conducting themselves. That's why I asked the question, why has he been brought here in this manner? Why has he not been firstly invited to bring a statement? Because they can do that. They cannot tell us that when the ministers that they brought here were firstly implicated on paper, and then of course they must have consulted with them. He can correct me if I'm wrong. A statement was created, and then of course you've got their statements here. Mr. Zuma doesn't have a statement created by the evidence leaders. Why is that so?
Yes. Thank you. I think what I would like to do is that we take the tea break, and at the end of the tea break, may I see counsel on both sides in my temporary chambers here. Can I see both counsel on both sides, and just to try and see if we may at least achieve a common understanding as to where the concerns are and whether there is a way of resolving them in terms of the way forward without me having to make any ruling.
Thank you, Chair.
Yes. We'll take the tea adjournment now. It's about 22 minutes past 11. I think let us aim to resume at 12 to give ourselves time for tea and time for the meeting that I must have with counsel on both sides.
Thank you, Chair.
We adjourn.